Welcome to Milk and Mummies podcast. This podcast was created simply because I found myself happily pregnant and self-employed and wondering, how was I gonna juggle it all? Get comfy as we talk all things motherhood, working for yourself, and finding that elusive balance, honestly. Hey guys, forgive any glitches that you may hear. This is an online podcast session. So hopefully there will be no connectivity issues. But if there are, please forgive me. Please forgive us.
Hello.
Hello, we did it.
Hey, sorry, I'm a little bit late. It's evening bedtime chaos in our house at the moment.
Thank you for accepting this late time to do it as well. No worries at all.
Hey, that's all right. No troubles. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. Just, life with three kids in the house, you just roll with the chaos.
There we go. Exactly. I'm learning that so swiftly from anyone who's got more than one child. Just everything's in flux. Yeah.
One child feels like no kids. Like the days when my oldest two are at nursery and school and I've only got the younger one, I'm like, this is quite nice, isn't this? This is quite calm and easy. Whole different perspective.
Exactly. What's your age range with your kids?
So oldest is 6.5, and then middle one's 2.5, and then youngest is 5 months.
Okay, yeah, busy.
Yeah, but no, it's all right actually. It's quite nice that the older one is that much older because it's like having another little adult around sometimes. Like she can kind of help with the middle one while I'm dealing with baby, and it definitely makes life easier.
Amazing. Thank you so much for finding the time to get involved in this podcast. I just think people are going to find this so invaluable, especially if they don't have an understanding or an awareness of lactation consultants at all. So I'm super excited to have you on here just to chat away with us. Do you mind telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm a midwife and an international board certified lactation consultant and holistic sleep coach. So professionally, what that kind of means is that I work with mums all the way from antenatal care during pregnancy. I've worked on labour and birth suites in postnatal wards, hospitals, community, that sort of thing. And then I also specialise in breastfeeding management of all varieties. So I do antenatal education, work with mums postnatally, right from like newborns and establishing feeding all the way through to toddlers and weaning and all of the dramas in between. And then I also work with parents in conjunction with that, supporting breastfeeding parents with their children's sleep as well. And then in the off time, I'm mum to 3 kids myself and have been through all sorts of fun breastfeeding journeys with them as well, which is, I think in a way kind of helps my practice. The fact that I've done that and I've kind of experienced a lot of that firsthand and I can put myself in the shoes of the women that I'm working with has definitely made a difference. So yeah, juggling all the things.
We go. Before you had kids, were you in your line of work professionally before you had your children?
Yeah, so I'd been a midwife for a couple of years and then I qualified as an IBCLC probably about 6 months before I had my first, which was an interesting experience because I definitely went into having children with a lot of anxiety about birth.
Okay.
And I think a lot of that came from the fact that from the point when I graduated, I went straight into doing a graduate midwifery program in what in Australia we call a tertiary hospital. So it was a high risk hospital. Okay. So we were dealing with all the things that go wrong and a lot of intervention and a lot of really difficult birth circumstances. And I think that gave me a lot of anxiety. So I went into having kids really worried about that. The breastfeeding stuff, I was like, well, I've got this. Like, I'm a midwife and IBCLC. This is going to be smooth and easy and fantastic. And I didn't really think too much about that. I did a lot of birth prep and a lot of, put a lot of things in for that. But yeah, thought breastfeeding that'd be fine. Like, I know what I'm doing. It's all good. And in principle, I did know what I'm doing, but I then ended up with a baby with a very restrictive tongue tie.
Okay.
And had some supply issues. We had weight gain issues, had all sorts of other things. And that really took me by surprise because I thought I had that bit down. And then suddenly, and also I think it was an interesting experience because I knew all the things, but when you're sleep deprived and you're hormonal, and I had multiple health professionals around me telling me, just having a quick look in her mouth and going, no, she doesn't have a tongue tie, she's fine, latch looks good. And I kind of sat back and I started to think I was imagining things. I started to think, hang on, maybe a second, maybe I didn't know what I was talking about. Maybe this is what breastfeeding is supposed to be, and it's just supposed to be this painful, and she's supposed to need nipple shields, and I'm
Yeah.
supposed to have all this. Maybe I had it all wrong. I was so tired and hormonal and everything else. And it took a good few weeks of doubting myself to then go, no, hang on a second, this isn't right. I know what's going on here.
Yeah.
And thankfully was able to reach out to a colleague. I was living in the UK at the time who was a private tongue tie practitioner, and
Yeah.
got straight in to see her and got her looked at. And she said, yeah, I've got really restrictive tongue tie here. And we divided it, and we then started the process of improving things. But it
Yeah.
was it was a really valuable learning experience for me, because I thought I was prepared for that process.
Mm.
And then I really learned the impact that can be had on a new mum when you've got even health professionals around you
Yeah.
saying, no, it's fine, don't have tongue tie, latch looks good, all those sort of comments that come out. And that was kind of my first exposure to it, because I was fairly new as an IBCLC. It was my first exposure
Yeah.
to that misdiagnosis and that misinformation that I've now come across on almost a daily basis in the years since then. But it
Mm.
was really interesting feeling that from mum's perspective, and looking back on it now, I definitely think what made the difference for me was knowing how to recognize what was wrong and knowing what to do about it or who to see about it.
Yeah.
And I think if I hadn't had that, definitely, and probably a bit of stubbornness, definitely can see how people give up and use formula, because at that point, when it was so painful and it was taking, an hour and a half to feed her each time, and all that sort of thing. If I didn't know how to pick up on what was going on, didn't know what to put in place and who to see, I would have just given up, because it was really horrible. And I can see now, having experienced that, how so many mums do, because they think, well, I've had a midwife or a health visitor tell me that my baby doesn't have a tongue tie and the latch looks fine. So I guess this is what breastfeeding's like, and I'm not enjoying this, so I'll just stop. And yeah, it was a very interesting experience.
It's really tricky because I think people don't often find consultants and professionals like yourself in your industry unless they go looking for you, if that makes sense, or
Yeah.
unless via word of mouth. And I came across your industry and your field again through word of mouth.
Mm,
I was having a little bit of not so much having difficulties breastfeeding, but it was my first baby and trying to get my head around what it's supposed to be. And I can imagine, like so many new moms, if especially if you want to breastfeed, you going knowing, okay, it's gonna work, it's gonna happen. You may have some anxiety around it because you've never done it before, but it's gonna happen. But once you start to find or come across any challenges or things that aren't just sort of going according to plan, I think that's when you start to do your wider research. So I almost want to ask, this is such a difficult question, I think, but I almost want to ask you, how can people access people like yourselves easier or easily, if that makes sense, without having to do extensive research per se?
yeah. Look, I think you've touched on something really important there, because unfortunately, and it does vary in different parts of the world, but unfortunately, there isn't a huge amount of, um, sort of IBCLC support available through mainstream sources. And unfortunately as well, and I have worked across Australia and the UK, and I encountered this in the UK as well, that actually within the NHS services, they won't recommend private practitioners. They won't even tell mums that they exist. So unfortunately, a lot of mums, if they're not getting the support through the usual channels, then they think that must be it. That must be all that's available. And like you said, unless they go off and do their own research, they don't necessarily find out. And I actually think if there's any mums listening to this who are like pregnant or planning to have a baby, or you're kind of listening in preparation, the
Mm.
best thing you can possibly do is actually link in with an IBCLC before your baby's born,
Okay. Okay.
because there's a really important point that you touched on there, where you sort of talked about, a lot of mums assume that breastfeeding is natural and it'll just happen and it'll be fine. And unfortunately, that is actually perpetuated in a lot of situations with antenatal education. And I experienced this as a first time mum myself. I went along to antenatal classes mostly because my husband dragged me along, because we were new to the area and he wanted to make friends.
Got you.
And I sat there cringing through a lot of it, going, why am I wasting my money on this? But one thing that was really interesting, when we sat there in the breastfeeding class, and I think we had like a few minutes of like, here's a few different breastfeeding positions, and then very much all of the reasons why you should breastfeed and all the benefits of breastfeeding, which of course is important information. And then yeah, this just like, well, here's a few different positions that you can use, and that's breastfeeding.
That's correct. That's it. Yep.
And I can see how, for anyone who doesn't have that knowledge of how complicated the process can be, that you'd go, oh, okay, breastfeeding sounds pretty simple. Cool. Okay, yeah, we'll give that a go. And then when it's not straightforward, they suddenly think, well, hang on a second, I'm not prepared for this, and I don't have the resources and don't have the contacts and things. And that's why I think actually if you can, especially if you're a first time mum or if you've had challenges in the past, linking in with an IBCLC beforehand to actually have a consultation beforehand where they can go through in much more detail with you beyond just here's how to do a rugby hold.
Yeah.
Actually giving you a lot more information about how do you stimulate and maintain your milk supply, how can you actually help your baby to latch, what do you need to look out for, how do you know when your baby's had enough, how do you know when your baby's effectively feeding, all of those sort of issues. So you've kind of got that knowledge beforehand, and then you have then got that contact there. So when you have your baby and you're going through those first few days of feeding, if there's any dramas that come up, you've got that person at the end of the phone that you can connect with straight away. And with anything with breastfeeding, the sooner that you jump on it and deal with it, the simpler and easier the whole process is. And I think the reality is that breastfeeding is natural and it is what we were intended to do.
Yeah.
And for our babies, feeding is instinctive. But there's a lot of less natural, less instinctive sort of things that are going on with pregnancy and birth. And that's where the dramas come. People sort of say, well, breastfeeding is natural, like we're supposed to do it, so it should all just happen. But the reality is that we're dealing with mums who no longer grow up in a community where they're exposed to breastfeeding. We don't grow up with 12, 13 younger brothers and sisters that we see our mum breastfeeding. We don't have our auntie living next door and that kind of family environment. So often people have a baby and they might never have even held a newborn before, let alone seen someone breastfeed. And we're also dealing with a lot of interventions which impact on breastfeeding. We're dealing with medications during labour, which makes baby very sleepy. We're dealing with a higher rate of cesarean sections, which impacts on mum being comfortable being able to sit and breastfeed. We're dealing with more instrumental births and episiotomies, which then makes it difficult for mum to sit and breastfeed. We're dealing with more malpositioned babies because of how active we are in labour and how they're sitting in the pelvis. We're dealing with, more prolonged labours, which also has an impact on baby in terms of muscular restriction. So we've got a lot of babies who are trying to do what they're instinctively, what their brain is telling them to do. But if they've got restrictions through the muscles of their neck and their jaw because they've been born via forceps or after a really long induction or because they were, malpositioned in utero, then they can't do what they need to do. They can't open their mouth wide enough. They can't use those jaw muscles properly. So whilst breastfeeding is a natural process, there's a lot of things that impact on it these days that can then make it a bit complicated. And unfortunately, the standard in terms of the professionals that most mums have contact with, a lot of them don't have very extensive breastfeeding training. They've kind of got the basics. And then beyond that, a lot of them, and not, speaking for all, because there are some, midwives things out there who have got quite a lot of experience with breastfeeding, whatever, but there's a lot of, GPs and other people that mums have contact with who just don't necessarily have that breadth of breastfeeding training like an IBCLC does to actually delve a bit deeper into what's going on and work through things like tongue function and jaw function and all of those things that can have an impact on it. So, yeah, I think linking in with someone, in your pregnancy or as soon as possible after birth is really valuable. Certainly if anyone's listening from the UK, the Lactation Consultants of Great Britain site, so lcgb.org, I believe it is a fantastic resource. The vast majority of private practice IBCLCs are registered on there, and it's got a map and you can literally search where you are and it comes up with all sorts of options for people that you can see. So that's a really good resource as well.
Amazing. My gosh, I feel like I have so many questions and I don't want to interrupt anything that you're saying, so I'm just like, yep, that's right, that's what I went through, yep. Oh my gosh, did you know you always wanted to be in this part of your industry? I know obviously you said you started off with midwifery, but did you see yourself moving into this space, or did it sort of just fall into place naturally?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Like I even kind of, well, I wouldn't say I stumbled into midwifery. I left school and I went to train to be a teacher.
Okay.
And I did a year of early childhood teaching. And then in that time, did some traveling, met my husband who was over from overseas, took a bit of time off uni, and I took a couple of years and was living overseas. And it was during that time that something sort of clicked, and I went, hang on a second, yeah, teaching isn't for me. As much as I love kids, I'd rather deal with the mothers having the babies than deal with the babies when they're a bit bigger. And it certainly wasn't something that had sparked that passion when I was initially doing my training. And then it was when I went and did a graduate program. And as part of that program, what we did is we kind of moved through the different areas of the hospital. And the hospital I was working in had a specialist breastfeeding centre. Okay. So that was staffed full-time by lactation consultants, and any of the mums who had birthed within the hospital could access that support free of charge. And I did a placement down there for a couple of weeks, and I remember sitting in on some consultations with some of these IBCLCs and seeing some of the techniques that they were using, that sort of thing. And something just clicked for me, because I had just come from a placement on the postnatal ward, and I had found myself supporting these new mums, you know, day 1, 2, 3 with breastfeeding, and just not really feeling like I knew what to do. I was coming across these mums who were saying, I can't get them to latch, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. And I had 1 or 2 things up my sleeve, and then I sort of felt like I was out. I felt like I didn't really know what to do beyond that.
Yeah.
And it was when I went and did this placement, and I saw just such an expanse of breastfeeding knowledge that I hadn't come across before and that I hadn't been taught. I saw all these techniques they were using that I hadn't come across, and I went, oh, hang on, now that clicks, now this makes sense. Yeah, I can utilize that. And it was from that sort of sparked the interest, and that was when I then started the process of qualifying as an IBCLC. But I think over the course of the last, what's it been, 7, 8 years now, it's then, even that has been such a journey. I look back to where I was when I first started, and then all the things. I feel like every mum I see teaches me something. Every mum presents something to me that I might not have come across before, or in a different sort of circumstance, that sends me away to go and do some research and to go and, improve my skills. And that was kind of what led me down the journey of specializing more in tongue tie and tongue function. And I went away and did some more training, so I had better skills in assessing and managing that as well. But yeah, so it kind of came from that. It came from that placement that I just saw what they were doing and thought, oh, actually there is more to this. There is more that we can support mums with. There's more techniques, there's more information out there that I didn't have from my midwifery training. And that really, I felt quite hopeless about breastfeeding before. I felt like I don't really know what to do. I feel like I'm kind of out of ideas for you. And then that opened up this whole expanse of, oh, there's so much more that we can be doing for mums. And that kind of sent me down that road. And now it's sort of, become my little, me talk, out to dinner with friends or whatever, and I could just go on all night.
I was, as you were speaking, I was thinking you're probably the friend where if any one of your friends has the slightest question, slightest issue with breastfeeding, it's quick, Alissa, and then it just turns into work because everyone's coming to you for all the information and stuff.
Yeah, that's the there's no quick answers, there's no quick conversations when it comes to breastfeeding. That fire has definitely been lit now.
Do you ever find yourself having any sort of conflicts, maybe too harsh of a word, but do you ever find that you have conflicts with, say, the mainstream sort of medical space with what it is that you do?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because I've always come, even as a midwife, I've always come from the perspective of, as health professionals, as a multidisciplinary team, we're all working towards the same goal. We're all working towards that goal of, healthy mums and healthy babies, and, safe and enjoyable births and enjoyable breastfeeding experiences. And, we're all working towards that same thing. It can be difficult sometimes dealing with, I think, the conflict of information that comes from mums is probably the hardest part, because I think I firmly believe as a health professional, the best skill that you can possibly have is being able to admit when you don't know something, and admitting to a parent that you don't have the answers, and either going and finding the answers or sending them to someone who does. Yeah. And I think that's actually, it's a really hard thing to do, because they look to you as an expert in something, and it can be tempting to be an expert in everything. Whereas I actually think parents respect you a lot more if you go, actually, I don't know, but I'll go and find out for you. Or here's this person who's a specialist in that. That's something I always try to implement in my practice, that I will, if let's say I'm dealing with a mum whose baby has got really restricted tongue function, or we're dealing with muscular restrictions or whatever else, my response would also be, okay, well, here's what I can observe, but I'd like to send you to a tongue-tie practitioner for a review, or I'd like to send you to a pediatric osteopath for a review. And going, you know what, this is out of my scope. I can give you my observations based on the training and expertise that I have, but the next step in treating that's out of my scope, and I need to send you on to someone else. And I've got no issue with admitting that that's beyond what I can do. I think that the difficulty for me comes when I come across mums who have been given a lot of conflicting information and sometimes just actually incorrect information. And I find that really frustrating on their behalf, especially when you come across the same outdated or incorrect or non-evidence-based information over and over and over again. And sometimes it can be quite damaging. Sometimes it can send mums down, quite a troublesome path, especially with their breastfeeding journey. And then I come in and see them, and you're sort of fighting, like, I never want to, blag another health professional, but you're fighting that urge to say, oh my God, I wish they hadn't said that to you, because that's not correct. We don't have evidence to back that up. It might have been something that this person has heard from somewhere and been repeating for years and years and years, but we haven't actually got evidence to back that up. And that's what I think is most frustrating, when mums are being given answers or given advice, perhaps, from someone who doesn't necessarily have the expertise or training to do that. And those people aren't going, you know what, I'm not trained to do this, so let me send you to someone who is. And that was the exact same experience I had with my daughter with the tongue tie. And I remember a midwife and a health visitor both glancing in her mouth and going, no, she doesn't have a tongue tie. And, at the point that I am now, knowing what I am now, after having worked with tongue tie practitioners, after having done some more training with them in tongue function and managing all of that, and, you can't determine whether a baby's got a tongue tie or not just looking in their mouth. You have to do a full functional assessment of what's going on there. And it's things like that I wish that, for parents' sake, I wish that as health professionals we'd go, I'm not trained in assessing tongue tie, but if you think that there's an issue and feeding's painful for you, let me send you to a tongue tie practitioner, let me send you to an IBCLC and get them to actually assess what's going on. And that, I think, is where some of the conflict comes from. And I always try to communicate with other health, professionals where I can and say, hey, look, I've seen this mum and this is what's going on. And, to try and help support that for them for the future. But I think that's probably the biggest sort of frustration there, when you see these mums who are just in the absolute pits because, feeding's excruciating and their baby's taking hours to feed and they're losing weight and they're topping up with formula and they're pumping like mad. But they've been told that, the latch looks good, or they don't have a tongue tie, or, this, that, and the other. And then when you come in and say, actually, okay, X, Y, and Z is the issue, and they go, I was told that wasn't the problem. I thought this was, they were just at that state of feeling completely hopeless because everything they thought might be the issue they've been told wasn't. And then they find out actually that information wasn't correct. And it just makes things so much more difficult for them. I think that's the most challenging part, I think, when we just aren't able to admit and go, I don't know, let me send you to the person who does.
No, it's tricky. As you were saying that, I'm thinking of my breastfeeding journey. Everything came in as it was supposed to happen. My milk came in a couple of days later, as it's supposed to, in terms of looking at something standard. And my little one, I don't think she had difficulties latching. I think I had difficulties understanding how it should all sort of connect, if that makes sense. I remember going to a few breastfeeding workshops, which were very, very helpful and very, very useful. It was very community-based. But initially, I had someone look at my little one and sort of say, oh, she's got a bit of a tongue tie, which I was like, I don't know, because as you just said, people just have a look and then that's the assessment. There wasn't anything further to really back that up. And it was like, oh, no one had ever mentioned that to me. That's a surprise. Then I was introduced to nipple shields, and the thinking was, try this to help with her latch, and then we'll see how it goes to sort of, we've introduced this, let's take it out. But nothing sort of happened with that. Nothing got followed up with that. So I ultimately made the decision to, like, okay, I'm going to use this for however long. I'm going to stop and take that out. So it was very strange feeling not necessarily bombarded with this information, but given all this information without any sort of real backing to it, and then being left to your own devices to, okay, well, then that's you done. So you say these things, it's true. There's definitely, depending on where you go, it's true, because not every practitioner or workshop space is the same. But it really does depend on who you get as to how involved they're going to be, or how precise assessments and understanding everything is different. And if it's not a tongue tie, don't say that it is, because that's the typical or obvious thing to sort of say. And it's just such a tricky space, because if you've never done this before, you are literally going with people, like you're taking it as gospel. And even if you do
Mm.
try to find the time to do the research, if you're sleep deprived or haven't had the time to do this, or you can't go here or there, the other, it can really feel so overwhelming, and just like, where do you even go? So yeah, with you just speaking there, I'm just like, I know so many people who went through what you just described and explained. Absolutely
Mm.
wild. I'm like, this is crazy.
And it's mad. And I think that's why, like I mentioned earlier, like my experience, especially with my first, was so valuable to me now as a breastfeeding professional, because it made me realize the impact of that sleep deprivation and those raging hormones and all of that that's going on. Like even in, you know, a like in my very logical brain who had all this knowledge and all this experience, I was still doubting myself and thinking, well, I've had, you know, multiple other health professionals tell me that everything's fine. So maybe, like, am I imagining things? Am I doing something wrong? Like, so much doubt was creeping in. And, you know, like I said, like, especially when you're a first-time parent, you don't know. Like you've gone from being an adult who was at, you know, the top of your priority list, usually a working professional, and you were functioning and succeeding and doing things on a daily basis. You were doing what you wanted when you wanted, and then in the space of 24 hours your life has been completely flipped upside down, and you've got so much pressure on you looking after this new little person and trying to make sure you're doing everything right, and you worry about absolutely everything. On top of that, somewhere in there, you're trying to recover from a pregnancy and a labor and a birth, and you're trying to deal with the massive, you know, emotional overload that's going on with you every time you stand in the mirror and your body doesn't look the same, and you're dealing with, you know, engorged breasts and, you know, leaking breasts, and you're feeling absolutely rubbish and you're exhausted and you're kind of, you know, you're not pregnant anymore, you don't have a cute baby bump, but you still look like you're pregnant, and none of your clothes fit, and all the things that do fit you can't feed in. And, you know, it's so much going on in, like, even I would say probably that first 12 months, but like especially those first few months, there is so much going on. Like you're in a state of overwhelm anyway. Before anyone gives you any information, you're in a state of overwhelm. And then when you get, you know, conflicting information, or you get, you know, and you're like, I mean, I know some mums who've come across even those first few days that, you know, you get, like, you know, if you birth in hospital, you get one midwife on a shift who says, do this. And then the next one comes in and says, no, don't do that, do that. And you're sitting there going like, guys, I don't stand a chance here. Can you all be on the same team, please? Pick a side, pick a way, and then tell me that way, because I'm already so overwhelmed trying to keep a person alive here. Like,
how long have you been in the industry overall?
what would it be now? 10 years now.
And in that 10-year journey, how much has I guess systems and techniques, how much has that changed from what you've been able to witness and observe when it comes to breastfeeding? Has it gotten more streamlined, easier, or just a bit more confusing because there's Google, there's YouTube, there's everything now?
I would say in a way it hasn't really changed much at all. And maybe that's part of the problem, that a lot of the, you know, if I think about the kind of information that I would hear from mums that they had been told or that they had come across 10 years ago, it's probably not all that different to a lot of what they're being told now. I think it varies a lot depending on your healthcare setting and where those practitioners are coming from. And that does vary a lot. And unfortunately, there's such a wide range of kind of the amount of breastfeeding training that different professionals have, but B, where they've picked things up from and where they've learned from. And that is, you know, when you work in an industry where you spend a lot of time as a student, you know, you're shadowing other people, you're learning from, you know, other midwives or other nurses or other GPs, whatever else, you do tend to pick lots of things up from other people that you don't necessarily have the foundation or the evidence for, but you hear other professionals saying it over and over, and you kind of go, okay, and then that somehow becomes a part of your practice. So there's a lot of, you know, that kind of process of things almost getting passed down through generations of midwives. And then at some point you've got to stop and question and go, hang on a second, like, where's the evidence for that? Is this actually a thing? Or are we just continuing to say this because, you know, so-and-so who taught so-and-so was saying that? I think the internet is both a blessing and a curse. There's definitely lots of really good, credible information out there. There's also an awful lot of very concerning information out there, especially when it comes to feeding. And whilst you're going to get better information from someone who's got some qualifications to their name, that doesn't always apply. And that is the unfortunate part, that sometimes you can't, just because someone happens to be a health professional. There is also a lot of concerning information coming out of health professionals. But I think you just have to be very particular when you're going on the internet, when you're looking for information like that, as to where you get it from. And first step would always be start with, especially if you're looking for breastfeeding information, there's lots of great websites out there that are actually created by IBCLCs and breastfeeding professionals. They're the best place to start. Don't just Google things. Don't just look at things that come from accounts that have 3 million followers on Instagram, because, followers doesn't necessarily equate to actual professional experience. If you see any product or technique or anything to do with babies or parenting advertised on social media, always just check for that paid partnership label, because you can pretty much guarantee that if that's the situation, that you might not want to take that information as gospel. But yeah, it's tricky. It is a bit of a minefield. It can be great, and there's lots of things that the internet gives us.
Yeah.
But you just have to be a bit picky with where you're getting your information from. Otherwise, you can get yourself caught up with thinking that you need to do something or not do something that actually there's no, evidence or foundation behind.
Yeah. Tap into that as well, just with obviously the rise of social media, and that's like how has that impacted your professional space? Sorry, I keep saying your professional space because I'm avoiding trying to say, I'm gonna get it all wrong. I can't ever get your acronyms right, so I'm avoiding
IBCLC.
with the rise of social media. How has that impacted the whole IBCLC space? I think that's right.
Personally, I do find social media really useful. I'm not the kind of person who is a natural at social media or enjoys it particularly much, but I do find it a really useful way to connect with a wider audience.
Yeah.
And I find it quite helpful to be able to put out some of that information, to be able to dispel some of that misinformation to a wider audience is really nice with the sort of scope that you've got with social media. But it also is a bit of a burden, because you do feel that responsibility for the information that you're putting out there, and to make sure that that is correct. And also it's difficult because, like we know, no two mums and no two babies are the same. So we can put fairly generic information out there that might apply to, a majority of the population, but it's not going to apply to everyone. So I do often feel like I almost have to put these disclaimers of like, well, this might mean this, or for some mums, this will be this, because it's not always the case. And you also do get a lot of armchair experts coming back to you on social media, which I find really interesting, especially when you get into, I guess, what recently has been sort of more controversial issues like tongue ties and things. I get a lot of people, commenting back with their personal opinion based on, what one pediatrician told them, or their one child that they've had, or whatever else. And you get a lot of that too. But yeah, I find it quite useful. And I think if, mums are going to be on social media, it's going to be a part of their life. So if, as professionals, we can kind of try to drown out the misinformation with some more helpful evidence-based information, then I think that's a valuable thing to do.
Is it quite difficult to do, to try and sort of combat the armchair diagnoses, or this is what I saw, I heard? Is it quite difficult trying to balance that space, or just...
It does feel like it sometimes. It definitely does. There are days, sort of particularly when I've been seeing clients and things, and you might see 3 or 4 clients, and every single one says, told me this, that, or the other, and you just keep hearing the same misinformation over and over again, and you sort of feel like you bang your head against a brick wall sometimes, having to go and then kind of undo the damage that's been done by that. And it is really, really frustrating. And I think in some areas as well, different places in the world are different in terms of their attitude and their understanding of what an IBCLC is, and therefore the level of respect for that expertise that is given, especially from other health professionals as well. But yeah, it can be really tricky. And look, I don't tend to engage with most people who, sort of put their very, they think their professional opinions out there based on just their personal experience, or based on, well, my pediatrician told me X, or my GP told me this. But it sometimes it does feel like you just can't change these people's minds, and they will take everything that's come from, a GP or a doctor as gospel, and they won't ever question that. And there are some people that I think, you just can't change their minds, but it does feel like an uphill battle trying to change that. And I think that's why, if if we can all be on the same team, if we can all be working together to help mums, and we can be sharing information, because that ultimately is what we need to do. We need to better educate all health professionals so that when mums do go, to their GP, for instance, say, look, I think my baby's got reflux, the response is not, here, let me prescribe you Gaviscon. The response is, okay, so how's your baby's feeding? And, have you had some support with that? How's your milk supply? How's the flow? Have you got any history of allergies? They can be exploring all of these other things before we go straight down the route of medicating something that actually may not need medication at all. But there's enough knowledge there to identify some of those red flags and go, okay, let me send you on to this person for some more in-depth support before we go down the route of just giving prescription medications to babies who might only be a couple of weeks old. So I think that's almost what we would all like to think that we're working towards is that goal. We can all be on the same team and we can be sharing that information and better educating the other array of health professionals that mums are having contact with, so that they've just got that little bit more knowledge about management of breastfeeding, and therefore they can support better, they can identify those issues earlier and then send mums on for the right support, rather than mums kind of feeling like they're bouncing from one professional to the next and every single person's telling them a different thing and no one's actually really linking in with each other.
Obviously you're adjusting to now being in your new space. How are you finding the healthcare industry in Australia in comparison to the UK, where it comes to supporting new mums and breastfeeding in that space as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting because I've just had my third baby, so I've just been through that kind of system, but from a very different perspective, which has been quite interesting. And I wish that I could say that a lot had changed in the 10 years since I've been here. I don't feel like a huge amount has. I think certainly I find like it is, like I've mentioned before, like I have done work here in, government funded breastfeeding clinics where mums can actually access support from an IBCLC free of charge. And I wish that was something that more places had. I feel like that would be so valuable to invest in, because ultimately it is an investment. The money that you spend on that support now is money that you're saving on hospital admissions for children. Later on, it's money that you're saving on GP appointments for all sorts of illnesses that those children might avoid or might get less often because of the benefits of them having been breastfed. So I think it is definitely an investment, but I do think that would be something that would be so valuable to have some sort of government funded or subsidized support. I know in the US and Australia, where sort of private health insurance is a bigger thing, there are some private health insurance companies which will subsidise support from a lactation consultant. So I think that is really helpful for mums as well. That's obviously, private health is obviously not such a thing in the UK, or it's kind of an emerging industry. But I think having some sort of subsidised support or providing some of that within what's available to mums funded by the government would just be amazing. And as a lot of us do work privately and we do what we can. A lot of IBCLs run free drop-in groups. I used to do that for a number of years before COVID and things, and that kind of put a stop to things, but do a lot of free drop-in groups, do a lot of other, wherever we can, reaching out and providing that support. But actually there's a limit on how much we can do that. And I just think if mums are able to access that support, at least with some sort of subsidy, so that money didn't have to be an obstacle to you getting qualified breastfeeding support, because it is so important for the health of us as a community, and it's also so important for mum's mental health. And I think that's something that is so often overlooked when we're experiencing challenges with breastfeeding. And it probably comes from a well-meaning place, but I work with a lot of mums who are really struggling and really overwhelmed, and those within their support system say, it's all right, don't worry, just give them some formula, it's fine. And they probably think that they're helping, and they think that they're trying to provide an out and kind of, get you off the hook and take that pressure off. But actually, to a mum who's really determined to breastfeed, that isn't a fix. It's actually worse, because doing that feels like failure. And that's where, it can be really difficult. And I think, as a partner or, a family member or someone who's, around a new mum who's struggling with breastfeeding, instead of saying it's all right, it's okay, you can give you some formula, why don't you say, hey, here, I found this lactation consultant online. Shall I book an appointment for you? Like, that would be so helpful to those mums, because I think sometimes, especially when you're really determined to breastfeed, formula just feels like giving up. And not that, I'm not anti-formula by any means. There are some situations with clients where I might even recommend that in a particular circumstance. And ultimately, my attitude, I always go into a consult with a client and say, what do you want to do? Do you want to breastfeed? Do you want a formula feed? Do you want a combination feed? You let me know where you're at and we'll work towards. And that's completely fine. But I think it's really important to just kind of, acknowledge that actually having access to that support has such an impact on the mental health of new mums. And I've seen so many mums who are burning themselves out trying to breastfeed, dealing with issues that just haven't been picked up and therefore haven't been solved. And all around them, they've got people trying to give them an out and saying, oh, just formula feed, it's fine, just give me formula, they'll be all right. Whereas actually to that mum, that's not an option, because that's failing, and the impact that has on her mental health, because she feels like it's failing. The impact that has on her mental health is so significant that just doesn't feel like an option. Or if it is, it can end up with her in a worse place than when she was in that stressed, overwhelmed state trying to breastfeed. And I've seen mums months down the line saying to me, I wish I hadn't stopped. I didn't know what else to do at the time. I didn't know where else to turn, but now I wish I hadn't stopped, and can I start again? And, it becomes a real struggle, and really sometimes affects their experience of parenting as well. And I think if we could make more of that support available, or, for support people, if you're trying to help, make your go-to finding her some support. And maybe through the course of that, she might choose to give some formula, or she might choose to stop breastfeeding. If she does, that's fine. But she'll come to that decision in a space where she knows she's had the support, she knows she's tried all the things, and then that's the decision that she felt was right for her. And I feel like, from my experience of clients, that the position that leaves them with their mental health is in so much better space than when they just, stop because they feel like they have no option, and they feel all sorts of awful for having, given up, in inverted commas, and chosen formula.
I personally I'm pro breastfeeding. I exclusively breastfed and breastfeeding my little one, etc. So that's where I stand, and no judgment or whatever else in anyone who chooses to do anything differently. I guess, playing a little bit of devil's advocate, I suppose, do you think there's, and it feels like a ridiculous question because the breast milk is made for the baby, but do you think there's and not an unhealthy focus on, but I know some people who are pro breastfeeding can be very, breast is best and that is it, and you shouldn't do anything else. And I know that people can feel that sort of pressure or that weight from external people or medical professionals, etc. Do you think there's I guess an unhealthy maybe focus on breastfeeding at times, or is it just a case of we're now living in a space where we're trying to find quick fixes or faster responses to things, so maybe we're starting to feel a bit too sensitive to that kind of information coming at us?
I think the issue is actually where the focus is, because like you say, breast milk is created for babies. You could talk to your blue in the face on the benefits of breastfeeding. Not many people talk about the dangers of formula feeding, and phrase it in that way. And I think we do live in a space where everyone's kind of afraid of upsetting anyone. And so you feel like you have to kind of, be on that train. And, we can't be shaming anyone for doing this. If we promote breastfeeding, then we're shaming formula feeding mums. And that's absolutely not the case. When we're promoting breastfeeding, we're giving you scientific facts about why breast milk is the best thing for babies to have. And it is. That's not to say that formula doesn't have a place, and that's not to say that mums don't have the right to choose how they feed their baby. But for me, coming from the headspace of a midwife, informed consent is a really big thing for me. And I think if you're going to make that decision to formula feed your baby, you need all the information so that you're making a decision based on all the facts. And I think that's where the focus is in the wrong spot, because a lot of what you get, and I don't know what you found, when you were kind of pregnant and going through that process, but a lot of what you get when you're pregnant, when you just had a baby, you get all this information on, here's why breastfeeding is so great, and you must breastfeed, and this is really important for your baby. And that's not incorrect, that information, but we're focusing too much on the pressure as to why you should do it and why it's so fantastic, rather than focusing our energy on how to do it.
Mm.
And I think that's where the whole thing goes wrong, that mums do feel under pressure because they've had it, again and again and again throughout the pregnancy, through antenatal classes, through their midwife appointments when the baby was born, on the postnatal walk, where they were discharged. You get all these brochures on breastfeeding. And it's they feel like they're smothered in this pressure of why breastfeeding is so fantastic. But what they're lacking in is actually how do I breastfeed? And how do I know if my baby's breastfeeding right? And all of those little intricacies, that's the actual practical information that they need. The benefits is great, but we could do with one brief little chat on the benefits, and then the rest of the information on actually, right, how do you do it? And I think that's where it's gone wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with, and I think we should be promoting breastfeeding as much as possible. We need to be normalizing breastfeeding. It needs to go back to a situation where that is the norm, that is the vast majority. And then when you look at the statistics on breastfeeding in developed countries, places like the UK, and it's absolutely appalling. And I think what stands out the most is how quickly there's a decline from the number of mums who start breastfeeding to the number of mums who are continuing at 6 weeks or 6 months with exclusively breastfeeding. And I think that says a lot about where we're going wrong, really, in how we're supporting mums, where we're going wrong as a society and as, a healthcare industry in terms of what we're doing for them. Because I think, from trying to remember from last time I looked it up, but I think, it's something like about, 75 or 80% of mums start breastfeeding after birth. And then by the time they get to 6 weeks, it's down to somewhere at like 25% who are still exclusively breastfeeding. Oh. And then by the time you get to 6 months, it's down to about 1 or 2% that are exclusively breastfeeding with no formula or no other complementary foods. And that, to me, even over the course of 6 weeks, go from 75, 80% to 25%. We're going wrong there in those 6 weeks. We're going wrong in how we're providing that support to them. If we can have such a dramatic drop. And I think what's really interesting there, and it does vary in different places in the world, but, you have support from a midwife in the first few days after birth. You generally see your child health nurse or your health visitor, around day 10, 12, 14. And then that's it. And you're discharged. And oftentimes, in some areas of the world, you won't see someone again till 4 to 6 months. In some areas, you won't see someone again till your child is 1. So unless you seek out support and information there, we've got a mum who's got a 10-day-old, 14-day-old baby. And then, like you mentioned before, that phrase, left to their own devices. And they very much are. And breastfeeding isn't established at 10 days. Everything's not settled at 10 days. Like, there's so much going on at that point. So I think that's where the shift needs to be. I think we should be creating this environment where we are promoting breastfeeding, but we need to shift from putting the pressure on with why you should do it to providing more information on how you do it, so that we can start to change those stats and we can start to get 80+% of mums starting breastfeeding. And so that at 6 months, we can still have 70-80% of mums who are still exclusively breastfeeding. That's what needs to change.
Honestly, this conversation is just triggering just little memories that I've completely forgotten. Just like in the hospital, yes, you want to breastfeed, fantastic. And again, my little Anzina just having, again, I think it's just her processing what it means to be on a breast and all that kinds of stuff. But being told she's going to be losing too much weight, have formula, and bringing that as soon as, to the point where me and my partner had to kind of really reject that because we didn't want her to have formula. There is the understanding, of course, you want your baby to be fed, and there may be certain reasons as to why you will end up doing formula, whether it's you make that choice yourself or you had to go down that route, whatever, that's fine. But it was definitely a space of but don't forget formula is there, don't forget formula is there. And for someone who didn't want to go down that space, that was quite jarring, as opposed to breastfeed, which was really interesting. And I think I was lucky to have a community midwife when I came home and discharged, and that was my point of contact, who understood the pressures I was facing about my baby losing weight, because she lost more than the typical 10%. She went to 14%. But they were like, it is going to take time. You're doing everything right. Just trust the process. And we're here if you need us, which was wonderful. And it was great to have someone try and create that space of, no, give them a chance to really give breastfeeding a go. They're on it. They're focused. Baby's not in any danger or there's no concern. Let's give them a chance to do it. So that was really lovely to have. because the option for that formula was really like was here in your face. So that was quite an awkward space for sure. But even thinking about like the antenatal class that we did, and we did for the sake of doing, I think, rather than we felt like we needed to. I remember voicing a question to someone saying, what happens if there's an issue with your milk, if your milk doesn't come through? Because I actually had a friend who had a kid not too long ago, and she didn't have any milk at all. Her milk didn't come at all. So I was like, well, that could happen. What do we do in that
Mm.
space? And the response was, oh, no, no, your milk will come. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And that's it.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you were saying. I mean, when you had formula being offered like that, and offered and offered again, and here is an option. How did that leave you feeling in terms of your confidence to breastfeed and your confidence in your body's ability to provide for your baby?
I think that's a really good question. And I think I'm very happy and lucky that I am who I am because I said, no, this is what I'm doing. And that's it. In terms of my affecting my confidence, it felt more like an exercise in standing in your choice, your truth, in your own resolve. This is what I'm gonna do. So it felt like it was flexing that muscle rather than affecting my self-esteem or my ability to do this because my body is doing everything that my body is supposed to do or what I know it does in this situation. So you trying to get me to do anything else was just like, well, no, you're not giving me a chance here. And you're trying to interfere in the space. Throughout my whole planning of my birth, I didn't want any intervention. So I wasn't pro an induction, even though that was something that was offered to me to the point where I ended up booking a session knowing that I wasn't going to come and being induced. So I booked it to get out the conversation to then know I have to now chase you to cancel it, which is what ended up happening. And even that was a bit of a, well, if you cancel it, you run the risk of this or your baby could die or this, which was again you sitting in an office having to stand in your truth and say, yes, I'm going to make this choice, which can be an uncomfortable space because you're not meant to speak back to these people in these spaces of authority because these are the people that we go to help us in whatever our situation may be, whether it's birth or an operation or whatever else. So again, that felt like a training ground in, no, this is the choice that I'm making for my baby. This is the choice I'm
Yeah.
making for my family. So having formula offered the whole time, I had to really stand in the space of, no, I'm giving my body a chance. This is what I wanted to do, and this is what it is. It was difficult because in the hospital, so soon after birth, and they weren't really happy with how she was feeding or how much she was taking in. Formula was given, but it was because she was so new, it was a tiny bit. So I was like, okay, fine. Then it became a thing of like, okay, well, feed her, but then top up the formula. And I was like, "Ugh, all right, let's try this. And I was happy to make that decision. Okay, let's try. But
Mm.
it didn't put me off breastfeeding. It made me more determined to make sure I'm doing what I can and I'm stimulating in
Yeah.
the right way, or I'm eating in the right way, or in the way that I thought I needed to be, and I'm feeding her every 2 hours and all that kinds of stuff. And then there was just one day where I'd fed her, and I think they had asked me to now top her up with say 30 ml of formula, and we did. She took as much as she wanted to or was comfortable to, and then it wasn't even 10 minutes. She just projectile vomited, and I was like, you know what? You're telling me you don't want to do this. We're
Yeah.
done. And I was like, okay, we're gonna have to be in the trenches with this, and that's it. So it was kind of like it almost felt like a muscle flexing arena or session rather than my confidence was affected. But I do see how I definitely have had friends who've had babies soon after me or just before, and they were having issues breastfeeding. They were determined to breastfeed, but then they were having whatever difficulties. And for some, I think there was almost like I forget the term, but she didn't have enough, I guess, glands in her, enough mammary glands to
Oh, yeah. Hyperplasia, insufficient glandular tissue. Yeah.
That's it. So that was why she ultimately couldn't end up breastfeeding, but she did everything that she could in that space. And she dealt with this like notion of feeling that, that she'd failed or there was a problem to kind of really get in her head around, you know what? My body isn't shaped for this, for that reason, and that's fine. Let me make sure she's getting her nourishment in a certain way. So it's been really interesting watching how women deal with this. And apart from maybe the odd story where I know someone personally who's felt like they failed, everyone has been a bit like, no, this is what I'm doing and I'm going to stand by it. So that's kind of what that left me feeling. I'm grateful for that because I think if I'd entered into a space of I'm doing everything wrong. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh. I think that would have been such a difficult space to pull yourself self out of with everything else that's going around and you adjusting to this new space of motherhood. So I'm glad that that was my experience, but I see how very easily it could have gone another way if you just didn't have that focus.
Yeah, and it's great that you had that confidence, and almost sometimes, I kind of credit it's like a bit of stubbornness is quite helpful. And I think I was, yeah, like I say, I mean, I like all three of my babies have had tongue ties to varying degrees. We've had issues with, like oversupply and reflux and all sorts of other fun stuff. And I think 100% it was stubbornness about, for me, formula wasn't an option. So we were going to find a way through that. But I think, the point you touch on with, like not feeding so well in those first few days, giving a little bit of formula. And that is such a common situation that so many mums, particularly those who birth in hospital, will come across. I've seen it time and time again. And also there's little babies struggling with that. So we look at a baby who's feeding, in that first day or two, they might take 4, 5, 6, 7 mils of colostrum, a really small amount per feed. When we give a newborn baby formula, they will generally be having, somewhere in the region of about 30 mils to get enough nutritional content there, because formula isn't as nutrient dense. So most babies do have a larger stomach capacity than 7 mils, and sometimes we can fit that much in them. It doesn't necessarily mean that their bodies are able to cope with that. And I think, unfortunately, I think what we need to do, like I say, I'm not anti-formula. I think formula has its place, but formula should be down the bottom of a long list of other things that we do first. And then if we need to get to the formula, okay, cool, we use the formula. We're lucky to live in parts of the world where we've got clean water to make formula up with, and we've got that option there. But, especially in those first few days, and to any mums who are listening, if you've got a baby who is a bit sleepy, or, they're not feeding very well, or there's concerns over their blood sugar, there's concerns over their weight or anything else, especially in those first few days, start hand expressing. Say to your midwife, can I please have some syringes? Start hand expressing. Best thing you can possibly do, because we're providing more that we can give to your baby. We're able to give it to them from a syringe with finger feeding, which is a great method to use because it helps to train your baby to suck like they need to at the breast. And also we're helping to stimulate your supply. And this is where a lot of mums kind of go down that slippery slope, or, what some people refer to as kind of the top-up trap. Like once we start introducing formula, if we're not also doing something to stimulate the breasts and to stimulate milk production, then your body doesn't know that your baby's just had an extra 30 mils. Your body doesn't know that your baby's having this extra on top of every single feed. So it's only going to keep replacing what's actually being removed from your breasts. And it can't account for all that extra there. And the other really critical part about milk supply, especially in those first few weeks, is that, your body's almost, the easiest way I find to think about it is that your breasts are like, imagine if you're renovating a house and you have an electrician come in and they connect wiring up to all the light sockets in all the rooms. That's kind of what your body does during pregnancy. It goes and kind of makes the connections to those milk making cells so that they're ready to produce, and they start producing that colostrum in preparation for baby being born. But once baby's born, every time you feed, we're switching on and activating more of those milk making cells. So it's kind of like going around and putting a light bulb in each of those sockets. Every time we feed, there's another light bulb in another socket. What we want is to be able to light that whole house up. But if we're not feeding frequently and we're not feeding effectively and we're not giving enough stimulation, what we end up with is a house where only half of the lights have actually got a light globe in them and are working. And then we end up 6 weeks down the line where we've got a baby who's still relying on formula because mum's not producing enough because we haven't put the light bulbs in half of those sockets. And that's kind of where we can very quickly go wrong if we jump too quickly to introduce formula rather than saying, okay, we can see babies not feeding effectively, or they're sleepy, or we're worried about their blood sugars. Let's start hand expressing. Let's finger feed them some colostrum and then see how we go. So we're dealing with that issue of baby needing more nutrition, but we're also compensating by making sure that we're stimulating the milk production at the same time. And that ultimately is going to put mum in such a better space, and avoid what does creep in for a lot of people that I've spoken to, that doubt that if it's, oh, we need to give them some formula, we need to give them some formula. It's that little kind of, voice in your ear saying, oh, your body's not doing the right thing. It's not making enough. You can't provide for your baby. And for some mums, they'll have the confidence to shun that and be okay. I've seen a lot of mums, especially those who've had a difficult birth experience or a preterm birth or a difficult pregnancy, where they already kind of go into the process feeling like their body's failed them. You know, they've gone into labor too early, or there's been a complication with the baby, or they've had, you know, a really long labor that's ended in a cesarean. They're sitting there in that postnatal space feeling like their body has failed them, like it can't do what it was supposed to do. And for a lot of those mums, they hold on to breastfeeding for dear life because that's like the one natural thing that they feel like they can have some control of. That's the one thing that they can cling to when their pregnancy or their birth didn't go the way they planned. And in that space, us even saying, oh, we need to give them some formula just is, you know, it's like a knife to the heart of, well, clearly my body's not capable of doing anything. Clearly I'm failing at everything. I couldn't, you know, do X, Y, and Z in the pregnancy. I couldn't stay pregnant long enough. I couldn't give birth to my baby vaginally. And now I can't make enough milk for them. Like my whole, you know, and it creates so much anxiety for them and just completely shoots their confidence rather than saying, oh, okay, you know, your baby's not taking enough milk at the moment. So let's see what we can do to help stimulate your milk supply and help your baby to latch better. And let's give them some extra colostrum and actually supplementing when it's breast milk. Most mums are okay with that, doesn't have that same effect. It's when we're coming in saying you need this outside source of nutrition for your baby because you're not providing enough. And to a mum, I feel like that kind of strikes something deep in your heart when you say you're not providing for your baby. That notion of thinking that you've, you know, you see their weight dropping 14%, and you think, God, I've been starving my baby, even though you've not actively been doing anything wrong. It's just like a knife straight to the heart. So I think we need to be really careful with how we go about that because it's very easy to get very focused on a number on the scales or reading on a blood sugar machine, all these facts and figures, and forget that, you know, we're not dealing with a little robot that we need to get to a certain weight. We're dealing with a mother and a baby, and we're dealing with, you know, a really fragile space when it comes to mental health in you know, that early postpartum period as well. We need to be very careful with not just treating every breastfeeding diet the same and treating them like, well, your baby's lost this much and they weigh this much, so give them this much, this many hours. You know, we're making that whole process too scientific rather than stepping back and actually being in that space with that woman and how it's affecting her, and then coming up with a plan which is not only better for her baby actually getting breast milk in and the longevity of their breastfeeding journey, but is also protecting everything from her perspective and building her confidence as a mum. And I think it's really easy as practitioners to forget how quickly we can have a negative impact on that by something that seems so mundane as, oh, they've lost weight, give them some formula. Everyday thing that a lot of health professionals say on a daily basis to multiple mums, but it has such a bigger impact beyond just a baby and their weight gain.
My gosh. Yeah, that is just such a perfect way to sum up that whole process and experience for sure. It's pretty crazy. I feel like I don't want to end the conversation because I think there's so much more I want to ask and say, but I'm like, you know what? This is just the perfect excuse to have Alissa on another episode because
we have to have a part one and a part two, aren't we?
No, I really feel like it might be because like there's weaning the baby, there's this. I think there's just so much stuff to kind of delve into, but I don't want to digress too much because I feel like my brain is like, yeah, but ask this, ask this. I'm like, no. So, Alissa, thank you so much for your time and thank you so much for sharing all of this information. It has been so useful and so valuable and so mind-opening. And I think if anyone is in a position where they're about to have a baby or they're prepping, I think it's definitely going to offer you a different sort of perspective or a different layer you can add to the prep that you're doing. Can you just let us know where we can find you, what your socials are, all that information?
Yeah, definitely. So best place to find me is on Instagram. It's at Alissa Brown IBCLC, and you can come and follow me there. And then all my other links and information and stuff are there. But yeah, please do. If you've heard it, please reach out. I'm always happy for people to contact me with questions and information. And if you're a mum who is, you know, sort of pregnant and preparing for breastfeeding, things like that, I have a breastfeeding course launching in a couple of months' time as well, which is aimed at exactly that. And that will be a virtual course and long-term support from me virtually as well as part of that process. So yeah, do feel free to kind of find me and get in touch. Thank you for having me. It's been so lovely to chat, and it's been so lovely to kind of dive into into some of these issues. And yeah, I feel like we could talk for weeks, couldn't we? But it's been great to kind of share, and I hope, to anyone listening, that it is, helpful in the sense of just kind of sparking that little idea in your head of, okay, it might not necessarily be a straightforward process, but it's not because it's, what I shouldn't be doing. It's because of the society that we live in. It's because of the complications that, are part of pregnancy and birth these days. But there are ways around it and ways through it, and that it just kind of plants that little seed for people to just question and reach out and get that support and build that community, build your village before your baby's born, get all those contacts and all those links and have those conversations, so that whenever you think, this doesn't quite feel right, or, I'm dealing with conflicting information, you know who to go to, you know who to speak to, you've got all those details there, and you can jump on it as quick as possible before you kind of really get down into a deep, dark hole of struggling.
100%. All right. I mean, Alissa, I'll speak to you in a few weeks, basically. That's how I end.
The next one, shall we? Oh, no, that's right. Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely to chat.
Hey loves, before we sign off, just a quick note to remind you that everything shared on this episode is based on personal research and personal experiences, lived experiences. I hope we were able to give you some food for thought, but please make sure you conduct your own research and speak to your healthcare professional if you have any questions or concerns. Okay, with love, catch you on the next one.